context of a global market that by the end of this century will be in excess of 200 billion bags, almost double what it is today. And so the way to do this is to take plants that are high yielding, like Robustas, and make them a mainstay, a suitable mainstay in the commercial market. Is that there are lots of natural hybrids and what we call land races for Robusta. In an Arabica plant, it needs cross-pollination, in other words, pollen from a different plant in order to produce a flower and then a seed. Whereas in an Arabica plant, it's self-pollinating. The plant pollinates itself. And the result of this is just a wide variation in different types of Robusta plants in different regions around the world. In terms of its fruit formation, after the plant's pollinated, it takes a longer time for that fruit to develop, 10 to 11 months compared to 9 months for an Arabica. And the important thing with its flowering and the production of fruit is the difference in yield. Arabicas, roughly 250 to 690 grams per tree, compared with Robusta 500 to 1,000. But the difference is with Arabica, we're used to finding mostly wash coffees, whereas with Robusta, they're mainly natural coffees. And that's one of the reasons we find such a wide variety of quality levels with Robustas. But there are some nice high-grown Robustas, particularly in Uganda, the Congo, and Tanzania, that have very fine acidity and good cut qualities. This is because as a sort of an older species, older than Arabica, in order to survive, the Robusta plant had to develop strong defense mechanisms to both plant pests and plant diseases. And the way the plant did this was by developing greater levels of caffeine and greater levels of chlorogenic acid. We can see this here in a chemical analysis about caffeine. It varies in both plants, ranging from roughly 0.8 to 1.4% in Arabica, whereas in Robustas it could go from 1.7 up to 4%. On the other hand, when we look at the fruit acids, and citric acid would be a classic example, we find a much higher level of fruit acids in Arabicas than we do in typical Robustas. However, there are a number of consumers who really don't find high acidity pleasing, and therefore some form of Robusta coffee ends up their coffee of choice. Robustas have a longer, flatter bean. Arabicas have a longer, flatter bean opposed to Robustas that tend to be shorter and more round. But because of the nature of Robustas to cross-pollinate, this isn't always true. And there's some Robusta varieties that are producing beans that are almost identical to their Arabica counterparts. Particularly in terms of the bright acidity that's characteristic of good quality Arabica, Robustas tend to have a mild coffee that is a balance between sugars and acidity and sugars and bitterness. Because the exchange sets such a low price for Robustas, the Robusta farmer basically has the attitude, why should I bother to produce a good product if the market's not going to pay me for it? So this is the challenge that the Coffee Quality Institute is now facing in developing a fine Robusta market, making it transparent, and providing prices that are rewarding enough to the farmer that they're interested in doing a good job in producing fine Robustas. There's a tremendous genetic diversity which food scientists prize based on a slightly smaller sample, a 300-gram sample. London contract, they give defects by percent weight a lot of discussion with the people that run the London Exchange about raising their standards. And sort of adding insult to injury, they do have a standard that says it has to be 100% Robusta coffee, free of foreign odors, but there's no cupping requirement. No one ever tastes the coffee. So there's no mystery why Robusta tends to have a poor reputation in the trade that's really not deserved by the coffee or the coffee producers themselves. Look at this diagram, but all it's me is saying the strategy for the industry, if we want our market to grow, is to work hard to improve the exchange grades and to clean up the coffees that are low grade because of their defect count. Okay, UCDA stands for Uganda Coffee Development Authority. And the reason we started the program in Uganda is, first of all, Robusta coffees are native to Uganda. In Uganda, about 80% of what they produce are Robusta coffees. Okay, two, Uganda's producing both washed and unwashed Robusta coffees. And so they have some very fine Robusta coffees in Uganda. Most of those coffees are sold in Europe, and a lot of those coffees are sold in Italy, where they're used in espresso blends. And this was very apparent if you look at price levels in the from 1980 to 1999, roughly $1.13, but in the decade that followed, it was virtually half that. And the reason for that was enormous volumes of the major producers, Vietnam and Brazil, that were at such low standards that it just created a glut of low-grade coffees that brought that price level down. So the opportunity for Robusta in expanding the market is overcoming the scarcity of quality. And part of this involved finding the right genetic material with good cupping characteristics, and then strengthening the infrastructure, primarily the existing market niche. These are similar problems that we faced back in the 60s in developing the specialty market. So the strategy is basically the same: standards, education, and then business ethics to support the standards and education. We found that Robusta coffees actually have a wider range of aromas. And so we ended up expanding the coffee vocabulary that we have for Arabica coffees. And also, when we were doing our sensory skills test, we decided it's important to use acetic acid rather than citric acid, and potassium chloride versus sodium chloride for the salt test. But in terms of the overall market strategy for Robustas, it's virtually identical to what we've developed for Arabicas. Starting with the idea that price premiums are created because consumers can tell the difference between one product and another and are willing to pay a premium for the product they prefer. As we reach a 200 million bag market, we're going to need a substantially larger quantity of Robusta coffees. And if we want the consumer not only to drink more of these coffees, but to actually pay premiums for them, they have to be good tasting. So it brings us back to differentiating Robusta coffees is really the essential step that we need to make as an industry group to help all coffee farmers worldwide. That I didn't see much of is you really need to make a second and third pass at Robusta coffees. Because one of the things that happens when fluids are hot, they diminish our ability to perceive sweet.